A submarine cook changed the Battle of the Atlantic by throwing garbage into the sea. Not an officer, not an engineer, a cook. During a patrol in 1943, he began dumping kitchen scraps, overboard bread, peelings, food waste. German U-boat commanders saw the debris and reacted instantly. They dove deep. They went silent. Minutes later, submarines began dying. Because the scraps weren't waste, they were bait. And in this video, you'll see how a man who was supposed to be washing dishes turned German submarine doctrine into a death trap. By early 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic wasn't a contest of tactics anymore. It was a race against arithmetic. Every convoy that crossed the ocean carried more than cargo. It carried Britain's survival, food, fuel, ammunition, and German submarines were cutting those lifelines faster than Allied shipyards could replace them. Week after week, ships vanished beneath the waves, not in dramatic fleet battles, not in heroic last stands, but quietly. One torpedo, one explosion, one more burning oil slick stretching across the sea. By March, the numbers told a brutal story. Hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping lost. Entire convoys mauled in days. For every German submarine destroyed, dozens of Allied ships went down in return. The escorts weren't incompetent. They weren't cowardly. They were trapped. They could hear the submarines. Early sonar, still called ASDIC, could pick up contacts beneath the surface. A faint echo, a moving shadow. But hearing a submarine wasn't the same as killing one. The moment an escort ship accelerated to attack, the problem began. The destroyer surged forward at 15 knots. The sonar beam passed over the contact, and then nothing. A blind spot. For a few critical seconds, the submarine vanished from the screen. That was all a trained commander needed. German U-boat captains were drilled in one move above all others. When detected, dive deep, turn 90 degrees, reduce speed, go silent. By the time the escort circled back, the ocean was empty. Depth charges rained down on phantom echoes. Explosions shook the water. Pressure waves rolled through the depths, and then silence. Hours later, the same submarine would surface miles away. Batteries recharged, torpedoes ready. The escorts had done everything right, and still they were losing. This wasn't an accident of chance. It was doctrine. German submarines operated as wolf packs. Coordinated groups spread across convoy routes. One boat would detect a convoy and radio its position. Others converged silently, attacking from multiple angles. The escorts were overwhelmed not by numbers alone, but by predictability. German commanders knew how Allied ships hunted. They knew the attack patterns, they knew the depth charge settings, they knew how long an escort could maintain pursuit before fuel, fatigue, or empty racks forced it to disengage. Once you understood the rhythm, survival became routine. For the men aboard Allied escorts, that routine was torture. They watched freighters explode under torpedo hits. They listened to screams echo across freezing water. They pulled survivors from oilless, licked seas if there were any survivors at all. Then they hunted the killers hour after hour only to watch them slip away again. The psychological toll was enormous. Escort commanders filed report after report describing the same pattern. Detected, chased, lost. No lack of courage, no lack of effort, just no solution. The Admiralty analyzed everything. They improved sonar. They experimented with new depth charge patterns. They introduced forward-throwing weapons like Hedgehog, designed to explode only on contact. Each improvement helped. None of them changed the fundamentals. A submarine that went deep and stayed quiet was almost impossible to finish off. What made the situation even more maddening was that on paper, the Allies were winning the intelligence war. German naval codes had been broken. Convoy routes were rerouted to avoid known patrol areas. Wolfpacks were tracked before they ever made contact. And yet, when escort ships finally encountered submarines at sea, it still came down to luck. The moment of combat remained a black box. British anti-submarine doctrine was built on a critical assumption that once detected, a submarine commander would prioritize survival, dive, evade, escape. It was a logical assumption. A submarine represented an enormous investment. Steel, engines, weapons, and a highly trained crew. No rational commander would sacrifice that asset unless absolutely necessary. That assumption had shaped years of training on both sides. And it worked until it didn't, because doctrine, no matter how effective, creates habits, and habits create patterns. Patterns that can be exploited. By March 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached its breaking point. If the trend continued, Britain faced starvation. American reinforcements would never arrive in sufficient numbers. The war in Europe could be decided not on land, but underwater. Escort commanders knew this. German submarine captains knew this. What none of them knew was that the solution wouldn't come from a new weapon system. It wouldn't come from a research laboratory, and it wouldn't come from an admiral's conference room. It would come from an observation so small, so mundane that it had been ignored for years. Something that floated, something that looked like nothing, garbage. And on the other side of the world, aboard a submarine thousands of miles from the Atlantic, one enlisted man was about to notice a pattern that would expose the hidden weakness in German submarine doctrine and turn the hunters into targets. German U-boat commanders didn't survive the Atlantic by improvisation. They survived by discipline. Every maneuver had been tested, every response drilled, every mistake studied and removed from doctrine. When a submarine was detected, there was no debate, no creativity, no hesitation. Dive, turn 90 degrees, reduce speed, go silent. The procedure was taught the same way to every crew in every training flotilla. It worked often enough to become unquestionable. British escorts could chase sonar contacts for hours, but once a submarine disappeared beneath the thermocline and slowed to a crawl, the ocean swallowed it whole. To the German Navy, this wasn't luck. It was systemized survival, and systems create confidence. By 1943, many experienced U-boat commanders believed they understood Allied escorts better than the escorts understood themselves. They knew how destroyers approached sonar contacts. They knew how long depth charge attacks typically lasted. They knew that escorts had to keep moving or lose contact entirely. Once the first attack failed, escape became a waiting game. Dive deep enough, run quiet long enough, and the escorts would leave. This confidence shaped everything. German tactical manuals didn't just describe how to attack convoys. They described how to manipulate the enemy's behavior. Escorts were predictable. They followed doctrine. They trusted their equipment. And most importantly, they trusted what they could see. That last assumption was critical. For Allied commanders, surface indicators mattered. Oil slicks, debris, air bubbles. These signs were interpreted as evidence of damage or mistakes. German crews knew this, which is why dumping anything into the ocean during a hunt was forbidden. Garbage was handled carefully. Waste was compacted. Disposal was delayed. Nothing was allowed to float. Floating debris meant one thing, detection, and detection meant danger. Every U-boat commander understood that even a few scraps on the surface could betray position, heading, or recent activity. The rule was absolute, so absolute that no one questioned it. That was the problem, because what German doctrine treated as a risk, Allied doctrine treated as information. Escort commanders had been trained to read the sea. Anything unusual mattered. If debris appeared, it suggested haste or panic or preparation for a prolonged chase. Either way, it confirmed that the submarine was nearby and reacting. This mutual understanding created an unspoken agreement between hunter and hunted. If debris appeared, the submarine must be close. If debris appeared, the submarine must be running. And if the submarine was running, it would dive deep, turn away, and attempt to outlast the pursuit. That assumption governed every decision that followed. What neither side fully realized was that this assumption could be inverted. If debris always meant detection, then debris could also be used to create the illusion of detection. An illusion shapes behavior. German commanders were not reckless. They were cautious to the point of rigidity. Once they believed they had been spotted, aggression stopped. They didn't press attacks. They didn't maneuver offensively. They followed the script: dive, turn, wait. This behavior saved submarines countless times. It also made them predictable. For British escorts, predictability was the missing ingredient. They didn't need submarines to make mistakes. They needed them to behave exactly as trained. But as long as submarines dictated the timing of their own disappearance, escorts were reacting instead of controlling the engagement. The fight belonged to the submarine. Breaking that dynamic required forcing U-boat into responses they couldn't see coming. Responses that felt safe but weren't at the Admiralty. Analysts reviewed after-action reports obsessively. Patterns were mapped, timelines reconstructed. The data showed consistency but no obvious lever to pull. Every improvement in sonar range was countered by deeper dives. Every new depth charge setting was countered by silence and patience. It was an arms race fought in shadows. The flaw wasn't in German technology. It wasn't even in German tactics. It was in German certainty. U-boat commanders trusted doctrine because doctrine had kept them alive. That trust became dependence. Dependence became blindness. And blindness creates vulnerability. But that vulnerability wasn't visible from charts or technical manuals. It wasn't something an engineer could calculate. It required noticing something no one was supposed to be paying attention to, something mundane, something dismissed as background noise, garbage. Food scraps had always been present aboard submarines. Meals were cooked, waste accumulated. Disposal systems existed to eject it safely below the surface. No one thought about it beyond hygiene. No one thought about it as a signal. But signals don't require intention. They only require interpretation. Somewhere far from the Atlantic in a different ocean aboard a submarine fighting a different enemy, someone noticed that waste didn't just disappear. It left traces. Traces that could be seen, traces that could be timed, traces that revealed movement, more importantly, traces that triggered reactions. Enemy ships altered course, search patterns shifted, behavior changed. Not because they knew what they were seeing, but because they believed they did. The pattern wasn't in the garbage itself. It was in the response to it. Once you understood how commanders reacted to floating debris, you could predict what they would do next. Once you could predict behavior, you could shape it. And once behavior could be shaped, doctrine stopped being a shield. It became a trap. The Allies didn't need German commanders to panic. They didn't need them to make errors. They needed them to follow orders perfectly. That realization hadn't reached the Atlantic yet, but it was forming quietly in the mind of someone no one had trained to think about tactics at all. A man assigned to the most forgettable space on a warship, the galley. And the moment he connected floating scraps with enemy behavior, the entire logic of submarine warfare began to crack. He wasn't supposed to be thinking about tactics. He wasn't trained to analyze enemy behavior. He didn't attend briefings. He didn't sit in the control room during combat. He worked in the galley below deck, away from sonar screens and periscopes, surrounded by pots, knives, and the constant roll of the ocean. On paper, his job was simple. Prepare meals, clean up, dispose of waste. And in the rigid hierarchy of a wartime submarine, that meant he was invisible. He had no rank that mattered, no authority to question officers, no reason for anyone to ask what he thought, which is exactly why no one noticed what he was about to see. Submarine patrols were long, monotonous, and tense. Days blurred together in cramped steel corridors. The air grew stale. Every sound mattered, and every routine became familiar. Meals followed the same rhythm. So did waste disposal. At set intervals, food scraps were pushed through the trash disposal unit. The system expelled waste under pressure, sending it out into the sea while the submarine remained submerged. To everyone else, it was housekeeping. To him, it was timing. He noticed it first because he was closest to it. Because he handled it every day because repetition sharpens attention. Each time waste went out, something else happened. Not immediately, not dramatically, but consistently. Enemy ships adjusted course. Search patterns shifted. The water above seemed to come alive. At first, he dismissed it. Coincidence was easier to accept than the idea that garbage mattered. But the pattern didn't go away. It repeated again and again. Whenever waste was expelled, Enemy escorts reacted not toward the submarine's current position, but toward where it had been, as if they were reading a trail, as if floating scraps told a story. He began paying closer attention, not as a tactician, as a worker who noticed cause and effect. He watched the clock, he noted the intervals. He compared moments of disposal with moments of tension elsewhere on the boat. The connection became impossible to ignore. The waste wasn't disappearing. It was surfacing. Bread crusts floated, vegetable peelings spread, coffee grounds clung together. From the air or from a distance, it would look like evidence, evidence of haste, evidence of detection. Evidence that a submarine had been nearby and was now fleeing. He realized something unsettling. If waste revealed position, then waste also revealed behavior. It showed when the submarine was at periscope depth. It hinted at heading, it suggested speed. More importantly, it triggered enemy expectations. Enemy commanders didn't need certainty. They needed belief. Belief that the submarine had been spotted. Belief that it was escaping. Belief that the correct response was to pursue. That belief dictated everything that followed. He wasn't thinking in terms of doctrine or strategy. He was thinking in terms of habits. People reacted the same way to the same signals, and habits could be exploited. The idea didn't feel brilliant. It felt uncomfortable because if he was right, then something everyone considered meaningless was influencing life and death decisions. He brought it up cautiously, not in a briefing, not as a theory, as an observation. Each time waste goes out, they react. At first it sounded absurd. Waste was supposed to sink, disperse, disappear. There was no reason enemy ships should notice it. No reason it should matter. But war doesn't care about what should happen, only about what does. The commander listened, not because the idea made sense, but because the pattern had been noticed by someone who had no reason to invent it. That mattered. They decided to test it, not in combat, not at first. During training runs, the submarine altered its behavior. Waste was expelled at precise intervals. The boat maneuvered differently each time. The results were unmistakable. Floating debris remained visible far longer than anyone expected. It drifted. It spread from above. It looked deliberate, and enemy escorts reacted to it exactly as they always had. They treated it as confirmation. Confirmation that the submarine had been detected. Confirmation that it was fleeing along a predictable path. The realization was chilling. If garbage could reveal a submarine, then garbage could lie. It could create a trail that led nowhere, a false signal, a decoy. And unlike mechanical decoys or noisemakers, this one required nothing new. No factory, no research program, just waste. The next step was the most dangerous, using it on purpose. In combat, during a patrol, the submarine approached enemy shipping lanes. Instead of avoiding detection, it manufactured it. Waste was expelled deliberately in quantity in a controlled pattern. Then the submarine did the opposite of what doctrine demanded. It turned away while enemy escorts chased the debris. Convinced they were following a fleeing submarine, the real threat repositioned silently. The enemy behaved exactly as expected. They pursued, they searched, they attacked empty water, and while they did, the submarine moved into firing position. The torpedoes didn't care how the deception worked. They only cared that it did. Ships burned. Explosions echoed across the water, and the escorts never understood what they had chased. Afterward, there was no celebration, no speeches, just a quiet recognition that something fundamental had changed. This wasn't a trick. It wasn't luck. It was a lever, a way to control enemy behavior by feeding it information it trusted. The most unsettling part wasn't that the tactic worked. It was how obvious it felt once it had been seen. Garbage had always been there. Floating had always been possible. The reaction had always been predictable. No one had connected the dots because no one had been looking in that direction. The wrong person had a man whose job kept him close to waste, close to routine, close to repetition. He didn't think like a commander. He thought like someone who noticed when something didn't behave the way it should. And in doing so, he uncovered a weakness no amount of steel or training could hide. The idea would not stay confined to one boat. It wouldn't remain a curiosity. Reports would be written, copies made. The observation would cross oceans, and when it reached the Atlantic, it would give Allied escort commanders something they had never had before: control, not over submarines themselves, but over the decisions their commanders made, and that would turn doctrine into a death sentence. Discovering a pattern was one thing. Using it on purpose was something else entirely. Up to that point, garbage had been an accident, a byproduct, something that happened in the background of submarine life. Turning it into a weapon meant doing something no doctrine allowed. It meant choosing deception over caution. The first step wasn't dramatic. There were no alarms, no emergency dives, just a quiet decision. Instead of minimizing waste disposal, they controlled it. The timing was deliberate. The quantity was deliberate. The direction was deliberate. Kitchen scraps weren't thrown away when convenient. They were released when it mattered. Bread crusts, vegetable peelings, coffee grounds, enough to float, enough to spread, enough to be seen. Then the submarine did the opposite of what every trained commander would expect. Instead of fleeing along the implied trail, it turned away. Slowly, silently, the ocean above told one story, the submarine below told another. Minutes passed, then came the reaction. Enemy escorts altered course. Not randomly, not cautiously, decisively. They turned toward the debris field exactly as doctrine dictated. They assumed the submarine had been detected and was attempting to escape, and they committed to that belief. Search patterns formed around the floating waste. Depth charges were prepared. The hunt was on, but it was aimed at empty water. The real submarine was already somewhere else. For the first time, the crew wasn't reacting to the enemy. They were watching the enemy react to them. It was unsettling. Submarine warfare was usually defined by uncertainty, guesswork, risk. This felt different. This felt controlled. As the escorts focused on the false trail, the submarine repositioned quietly. No rush, no panic. The periscope came up briefly. Targets filled the lens. Merchant ships still held course, confident their escorts were handling the threat. Smoke drifted from funnels. Waves broke harmlessly against holes. The deception had worked better than anyone expected. Torpedoes were loaded, solutions calculated. When the order came, it wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The torpedoes ran clean. Seconds later, the ocean erupted. Steel tore open. Fire spread across decks. Men shouted orders that came too late. By the time enemy escorts realized what had happened, the logic of the engagement had already collapsed. They weren't hunting a fleeing submarine. They had been chasing garbage. The submarine dove again, deeper this time, away from the chaos, and once more, waste was released, this time in the opposite direction. The escorts found it. They attacked it. Depth charges exploded in violent patterns, churning the water, shaking nothing but empty sea. Below them, the submarine slipped away untouched. No heroic dwell, no technological breakthrough, just behavior exploited. When the patrol ended, the mood aboard the submarine wasn't triumphant. It was quiet. Everyone understood what they had just seen. This wasn't luck. It wasn't coincidence. It was repeatable, and that was the most dangerous part. The captain documented everything not as a story, as a procedure, timing, quantity, enemy reaction. The report didn't frame the tactic as clever. It framed it as inevitable. If enemy commanders interpreted debris the same way every time, then debris could be used every time. The report moved up the chain. It wasn't dismissed. It couldn't be because the results were undeniable. Ships destroyed, escorts misled, no damage sustained. Still, skepticism lingered. The idea was too simple, too crude. Garbage didn't belong in serious tactical discussions. But war doesn't care what belongs. The report crossed oceans. It reached desks far removed from the cramped steel corridors where it had been born. In the Atlantic, escort commanders were desperate for anything that worked. They read it carefully, not because it sounded brilliant, but because it aligned with something they already knew. German submarines behaved predictably once they believed they'd been detected. They always had. The innovation wasn't the garbage. It was using that predictability against them. The next question was unavoidable. Could it work against U-boat? The Atlantic was different. Colder, busier, more lethal. Wolfpacks didn't operate alone. They coordinated multiple submarines, multiple commanders. Deceiving one target was one thing. Deceiving several at once was another. But the logic held: if one commander reacted to debris by diving deep, so would the others. And if they all went deep, slow, and silent, they would all become vulnerable in the same way. The experiment had proven something more important than a tactic. It had proven control. Control over the enemy's decision-making. Control over the timing of the fight. Control over where the battle happened and where it didn't. For Allied escorts, this was the missing piece. They didn't need submarines to surface. They didn't need them to make mistakes. They needed them to behave exactly as trained. The experiment had shown that training could be turned into a liability. All that remained was scale, applying the idea not once, but systematically. And when that happened, when garbage stopped being accidental and became intentional, the balance of the Atlantic would finally begin to shift. Not because the Allies had become stronger, but because German doctrine had become predictable, and predictability, once exposed, is fatal. The Atlantic was where ideas went to die. It was colder, more crowded with ships, aircraft, and submarines than any other ocean on Earth. What worked in the Pacific didn't automatically work here. Wolfpacks didn't hunt alone, they coordinated. Multiple submarines spread across hundreds of miles, guided by radio reports, converging on convoys like a closing net. Deception had to fool not one commander, but many. That was the problem Commander Frederick Walker faced. Walker didn't look like a revolutionary. He was methodical, exhausted, and painfully aware that the war at sea was slipping away. By early 1943, he had spent months hunting submarines with limited success. His escort groups made contact. They attacked, and most of the time the ocean swallowed the enemy whole. 27 confirmed sonar contacts, 3 confirmed kills. The numbers haunted him. Walker understood the enemy better than most. He knew German submarines were not reckless. They were disciplined, and discipline meant predictability. When the report crossed his desk describing false debris trails, he didn't laugh. He paused because it explained something he had already sensed. Submarines weren't disappearing randomly. They were behaving consistently. They dove deep, they slowed, they waited. The report didn't promise miracles. It didn't claim instant victories. It offered something far more valuable. Control. Walker decided to test it, not as a trick, as a system. The North Atlantic in April was unforgiving. Gray skies, rough seas, cold that seeped into bone and steel alike. Convoy HX-2, 134, was moving east. 42 merchant ships stretched across miles of water. Somewhere ahead of them, German submarines waited. Sonar contacts appeared one by one. 3 submarines positioned in a patrol line. A textbook ambush. Standard doctrine called for immediate attack. Charge the nearest contact. Force it deep, then repeat. Walker ordered something different. His ship slowed. Crewmen carried sacks from the galley to the rails. Bread, vegetable waste, anything that would float. At his signal, the waste went overboard. It spread quickly across the surface, forming a clear trail, visible even in poor light. Then Walker turned away. Not sharply, not dramatically, just enough. Below the surface, German commanders raised periscopes. They saw the debris and they relaxed. Their training told them exactly what it meant. The escorts had detected them. The escorts were pursuing. The correct response was automatic. Dive deep, reduce speed, go silent. One of the submarines, later identified as U-191, followed doctrine perfectly. Its commander recorded the moment in his war diary. Enemy destroyer visible, surface debris observed, expect prolonged pursuit. He dove to depth, slowed to a crawl, and waited. Walker wasn't chasing, he was positioning. While one ship pretended pursuit, another held sonar contact from a distance. A third moved silently into position. This was the difference. The debris didn't just deceive the submarine. It bought time to coordinate, time to box the target in. At 1,400 hours, Walker gave the order. Hedgehog mortars fired. 24 projectiles arced into the sea ahead of the sonar contact, detonating only on impact. 7 struck the pressure hull. U-191 disintegrated nearly 500 ft below the surface. There was no warning, no chance to escape. The ocean went quiet. The other submarines heard it. Shock waves carry underwater. So does fear. The remaining commanders assumed the British had developed new deep-diving weapons. They reacted exactly as Walker predicted. They dove deeper to maximum depth where they believed they were safest. That belief sealed their fate. At extreme depth, submarines were slow, nearly blind, unable to maneuver aggressively without risking hull failure. They became stationary targets. Walker tightened the net. His ships moved into position above the estimated locations. Depth charges followed set deeper than German commanders believed possible. Explosions rippled through the water. One submarine was destroyed outright. Another was crippled, forced to surface. Gunfire tore into its conning tower. In 74 minutes, 3 submarines were eliminated. The convoy passed untouched. No merchant ships lost. No escorts damaged. It wasn't luck. It was doctrine turned against itself. Walker didn't celebrate. He wrote detailed reports, precise timelines. He described how debris forced submarines into predictable responses, how those responses created vulnerability, how coordinated escorts could exploit it. The Admiralty paid attention. They had to. The numbers were changing. In April, Allied escorts sank 15 German submarines. In May, they destroyed 41. The ratio flipped. For the first time in the war, U-boats were dying faster than they could be replaced. German Admiral Karl Donitz called it Black May It Not. He withdrew submarines from the North Atlantic. The wolf packs broke apart. For German commanders, the ocean had become hostile. What made the reversal so devastating wasn't the loss of steel. It was the loss of confidence. The doctrine that had kept them alive was now killing them. Dive deep no longer meant safety. Silence no longer meant invisibility. The rules had changed. Walker paid for that change. He drove himself relentlessly, months at sea without extended rest. Constant operations, constant pressure. On July 9th, 1944, while still on duty he collapsed from exhaustion. He was 48 years old. The Royal Navy buried him at sea. By then, his tactics had saved thousands of lives. The irony was brutal. The most decisive shift in Atlantic submarine warfare didn't come from a breakthrough weapon. It didn't come from superior engineering. It came from understanding human behavior. German commanders did exactly what they were trained to do, and that was the mistake. Their discipline became rigidity. Their certainty became vulnerability. All because someone realized that information didn't have to be true to be effective. It just had to be believed. The doctrine trap wasn't about garbage. It was about trust. Trust in procedures, trust in patterns, trust in the idea that the enemy would behave rationally. Once that trust was weaponized, the war at sea changed forever. And it all started with something no one respected, something no one considered dangerous. Scraps floating on the surface of the Atlantic. The shift didn't announce itself with a single battle. There was no dramatic declaration, no moment where the ocean suddenly fell silent. It happened in the numbers. In April 1943, German submarines began disappearing faster than expected. Not 1 or 2, but entire crews. By May, the pattern was undeniable. 41 U-boats destroyed in a single month. For the German Navy, it was catastrophic. Admiral Donitz called it Black May, not because of one failed operation, but because the entire logic of the campaign had collapsed. For years, submarines had ruled the Atlantic by choosing when to fight and when to vanish. Now they were being forced into engagements they couldn't see coming and couldn't escape. The psychological impact was immediate. U-boat commanders no longer trusted the surface. Debris meant danger. Silence meant danger. Depth meant danger. The ocean, once a shield, had become hostile territory. Crews hesitated before diving. They second-guessed doctrine that had once saved their lives, and hesitation is lethal underwater. The withdrawal order came quietly. German submarines pulled back from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The wolf packs dispersed. It wasn't a retreat in the traditional sense. It was an admission. The numbers no longer favored Germany. On the Allied side, the effect was just as dramatic, but in reverse. Convoys began arriving intact. Loss rates dropped. Shipyards finally caught up with demand. For the first time in the war, Allied planners could assume that supplies would arrive as scheduled. That assumption changed everything. Armies move on fuel. Factories run on raw materials. Invasions depend on logistics. The Atlantic had been the narrowest bottleneck of the war. Now it was opening. Without reliable submarine interdiction, Germany lost its ability to starve Britain into submission. American industrial power could finally cross the ocean unhindered. The war's momentum shifted, not overnight, but irreversibly. None of this happened because submarines suddenly became obsolete. German boats remained lethal. Their crews remained skilled. What changed was the environment they operated in. They were no longer fighting uncertainty. They were fighting expectation. Every decision they made, dive, wait, remain silent now carried risk, because the Allies had learned how to shape behavior. The debris tactic was only part of a larger transformation. Improved sonar, long-range patrol aircraft, better coordination between escorts. Together they formed a system. But systems only work when the enemy behaves predictably. And predictability was the one thing German doctrine couldn't survive without. By late 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was effectively decided. Submarine losses remained high. Convoy losses remained low. The balance never shifted back. Historians would later debate which innovation mattered most. Radar, aircraft, codering, all of them played a role, but none of them mattered if submarines could still disappear at will. The debris tactic didn't destroy submarines directly. It destroyed certainty. It forced commanders to react instead of choose to follow procedures that no longer protected them. That was the real reversal. The Atlantic stopped being a killing ground for Allied shipping. It became a corridor through which men, machines, and fuel flowed toward Europe. Without that corridor, there would be no Normandy, no sustained ground war, no liberation at scale. The war didn't end in the Atlantic. But it could not have been won without it, and the turning point wasn't marked by a new weapon or a secret code. It was marked by a realization that sometimes winning a war isn't about destroying the enemy's tools. It's about understanding how the enemy thinks and making them act exactly the way you want them to. After the war, historians would catalog the Battle of the Atlantic in familiar terms: radar, long-range aircraft, codering, industrial output. All of it mattered, but buried beneath the charts and tonnage tables was a quieter truth. The decisive shift didn't come from a machine. It came from attention, from someone close enough to routine to notice when something didn't behave the way it should. The cook never set out to change naval warfare. He wasn't chasing recognition. He wasn't trying to be clever. He was paying attention to repetition, to timing, to cause and effect. He noticed that garbage didn't disappear the way everyone assumed it did. And he noticed that enemy ships reacted to it the same way every time. That was enough. Not because the observation was brilliant, but because it was honest. It challenged an assumption no one else questioned. For German submarine commanders, discipline had been survival. Doctrine had been safety. They trusted their training because it had worked hundreds of times. That trust became their weakness. When Allied escorts learned how to exploit that trust, how to feed commanders information, they believed the ocean changed. Not physically, psychologically. Submarine warfare had always been about uncertainty, about who saw whom first. False debris didn't make submarines louder. It made them predictable, and predictability is lethal. For Commander Walker, the victory came at a cost. He pushed himself beyond endurance. Month after month at sea,